Vladimir Putin has secured a fifth term as president of Russia. His grip on power seems to be stronger than ever, with most of his challengers either in jail, dead, or in exile. After the polls closed, Putin commented for the first time about the death of his most vocal critic, Alexei Navalny, who died in an Arctic penal colony in February.
За несколько дней до ухода господина Навального из жизни мне некоторые коллеги сказали, и не сотрудники администрации, некоторые там люди сказали, что есть идея обменять господина Навального на некоторых людей, которые находятся в местах лишения свободы в западных странах. Вы можете мне поверить, можете нет. Человек, который со мной говорил, еще фразу не закончил. Я сказал, я согласен.
According to analysts, Putin pulled out all the stops to secure his electoral win. He sought high turnout to legitimize his decades in power, as well as the decision to go to war in Ukraine. According to Russia's Central Election Commission, Putin secured more than 87% of the vote.
This was definitely not a competitive campaign. From day one, it was clear that Vladimir Putin was widely expected to win, and the system was set up as such.
Authorities say the turnout was historically high, with more than 77% of Russians voting.
Мы все одна команда. Всех граждан России, которые пришли на избирательные участки и проголосовали.
The Kremlin used a series of tools to ensure people came to the polls, including a 3-day voting period and electronic voting in dozens of regions. An independent elections monitoring group reported that state-run enterprises also used more traditional tactics, such as enticing or forcing workers to vote.
A high turnout and a high vote for Putin is basically also an endorsement of his policies and essentially his war in Ukraine. The Kremlin can say that, look, people came out, they supported Putin. That means that they support the fact that he has invaded Ukraine.
The Kremlin didn't respond to a request for comment on allegations that the election results were fixed. Putin's image of a united Russia was distorted just weeks ahead of the election. Tens of thousands of people turned out for Navalny's funeral, despite fears of a brutal police crackdown. Putin's opponents, led in part by Navalny's widow, called on voters to flood polling stations at noon on Sunday, the last day of the election. Long queues formed at some polling stations at midday in several cities, including Moscow and St. Petersburg. The journal couldn't independently confirm whether those in line were there for the Noon Against Putin protest. Long lines were also seen across Russia when an anti-war candidate, Boris Nadezhdin, was collecting signatures to get on the ballot. His application to run in the election was blocked after election commissioners said they found errors in his paperwork.
What we saw before the election, that was really a statement. These people braved freezing temperatures to line up for hours in order to give their signatures for candidates who had declared that they are anti-war. It's very, very difficult to protest in Russia today. The level of repression is extreme. So you are left with the fact that you can go and line up in the street and give your signature because that is allowed.
Public concern over the war in Ukraine has also posed a challenge for the Kremlin.
People in Russia do not support wholeheartedly going to war. Yes, they support, defending their country, but whether or not they support going to war in Ukraine and dying for the country is another matter.
Wives, mothers and sisters of Russian soldiers who have been mobilized have been petitioning for the Kremlin to bring their loved ones home. They don't necessarily oppose the war itself, but are asking that those fighting be given a chance to be rotated away from the front line. But in order to make that happen, the Kremlin would need another wave of mobilization, which would be a risky political move.
It's very, very dangerous in some ways for the Kremlin because they realize that the call-up is not popular.
Fighting a war of attrition means Putin faces a tough dilemma: how to keep troops fighting in Ukraine without calling up more reservists.
Putin has made very clear that this conflict could go on for a really long time. In order to sustain that, he's going to need to keep Russians engaged and on board. He is going to need to have the support of the Russian people, the vast majority of the Russian people.